Hello, it's Maggie the Cheshire Crafter here. Now, a few weeks ago I uploaded a video about the fabric pull for a gemstone quilt, and I'm going to begin making that quilt in this video. And it's going to use yardage batik fabric and cotton fabric from my fabric stash behind me. When I wanted to make a quilt, I wanted a drop quilt and something similar to a chandelier quilt, but I wanted 3 bead drops. So I've created my own pattern, and I'm happy to share that with you here with all the sizes that you'll need to make a throw size. So this uses yardage, fabric stash and batiks. So come with me into the kitchen then, and I'll talk you through the cutting of it and the pattern and design. For my background fabric, I've got this white, it's luxury cotton duvet set. I bought it from Dunelm and I got it for £11. Now, if I cut the duvet cover set in two, I've got enough for a front and a background, and there's also 2 pillowcases here. There's a lot of cotton sheet in there for £11. From the duvet set, I've taken apart the 2 sides and I've put aside one section for the back so that I know that the colour matches. I'm going to cut this into 10.5-inch squares, and I need 56 in 4. And in order to get a 10.5-inch, I'm using my Fiskars ruler, which is 6.5-inch, and I'm using my easy rule. And I've marked with washi tape here so that I know how far across this is 4 inches. Now you can check that measurement with a tape measure too. Cut with confidence. From my batik, I'm cutting my 6.5-inch squares, and my Fiskars rotary cutter is 6.5 inches wide. So all I need to do is line up the edge. I've got 4 layers of thickness of fabric. I need to press down on it and then push forward to get a clean cut. What's left over from this sheet, I'm going to cut a 4.5-inch piece and a 2.5-inch jelly roll strip. So I've cut from one of the layers of the quilt that I've unpicked 56 10.5-inch squares. This throw size is going to be 63 by 72. It's going to be 7 rows across by 8 columns down. That's 56 squares. The remainder I've cut 2.5-inch strips and 4.5-inch strips. I don't know how much of this I'm going to need yet, but I've got lots of pillowcase fabric that I haven't yet cut. This is what they look like, and I'm going to calculate how many I need for my quilt. So I'm at my Singer heavy duty sewing machine, and I've set it up for a new project now. I'm going to do the middle pieces. So I've taken one of each colour, of each pattern, and I'm going to chain piece them with a 2.5-inch square either side. And to do this, I'm going to chain piece. Now, to do after a project, I've changed my presser foot back to a normal presser foot. I've loaded up my 2 bobbins. I've got a 50 weight thread in the top and the bottom. I've changed my needle. This is a 90-14 needle. I've checked my 1/4-inch seam allowance guides. My needle is in the right position, and my stitch length, at the moment I've got it on 2. I'm just going to change that to about a 2.25, just in case I've got to unpick anything. 2 is a little bit small for me, and I'm using a straight stitch. Right, let's start chain piecing. right sides together fabric right up against my 1/4 inch seam guide so that it's level with this guide, and I'm just going to ease it through. And before I finish, I'm going to introduce the next one. And as I add on the second white square, I'm just making sure not only I've got this line straight, but that this line, these two pieces of fabric, are in a straight line. Now open them out and just finger press towards the coloured fabric. And then just keep them together on a pin. Right, the blues next. For the purple, I need 12 squares, and I hadn't got 12 fabrics, so I've repeated some of them twice, and for that I've used a stripe or one of the darker, more prominent fabrics, because that will really show up in the centre of my 9 patch. When I've cut linen, I've tried to cut it as far as I can on the grain. Any problem here, and I would recommend that you use some starch. Going to see how it sews first. Now, to attach to the long strips, I need 2 of each design, 16 of these and 24 of these. And I'm going to do exactly the same, right sides together, and sew on one side and then chain piece. Once I've finger pressed them open, I've separated them into 2 piles, 1 of each design. This way, I can make sure I can get a fairly even distribution, although I want it to look a little bit more random around the quilt. Now pin and sew them together like you're sewing a 9 patch, and you can be sure that you can nest those seams together. So you're only going through 4 pieces of fabric at any one time. Press those seams to the dark side, and your block will now look like this. Now that all the squares are completed, in order to turn this on point, I need to turn 90 degrees. And then I need to square this up. Let me show you how to do that. I'm going to show you how to make this quilt up in columns, and each column that's going down the quilt is of the same colour. And I've got 4 of my patchwork squares, 4 batiks, and 4 of the 10.5 inch squares. I'm going to cut across corner to corner, and as you can see, it's just under 15 inches, but I'm going to move that up a little bit, and then I'm going to secure this with the dumbbell before I cut, and then I'm going to cut it in both directions. Now the long outsides are the parts that are going to be touching the coloured fabric. Take your central square and place it where there's a line. Now we're going to take each triangle and place it on the outside edge so that the longest edge touches the coloured fabric, and that now looks like a square. It looks like a diamond in a square, and that's exactly what we want. Now to sew it, I'm going to find the centre point of this triangle and the centre point of the edge of the batik square. To do that, fold your fabric in half and just make a mark, and then line it up with the mark that you've made on your fabric. I'm going to pin that in place, and if that is correct, then this arrow, it looks like an arrow now, will meet this mark in the middle. Likewise here, I'm going to do exactly the same here, and that will meet up there. I'm going to pin them, and I'm going to sew that edge and that edge, and then I'm going to repeat the same for the other 2 sides. Do 2 sides together first. I just want to feel and sew from that edge to this edge of the batik. Again, 1/4 inch seam, and I'm going to use a back stitch at the beginning and the end of this. Now finger press those seams in towards the centre colour batik, and I'm going to repeat the same on the other 2 edges. This time I'm going to sew this area of white cotton together from the edge to this edge so that the white will overlap. As you can see, I've deliberately made my squares big. I'd rather do that and then cut them down. Do it with your solid blocks first, and then when you're using your 9 patches, your piece with the 3 beads in, put the beads on the diagonal. So make sure that they match up right the way down the middle against a line on your board, and then sew them together like I've just shown you to create a square. And iron each block before cutting again. I'm going to place my square so that the corners are on that 45-degree line, and then I'm going to line up, use one of the lines on your board to line up your quilt to make sure that those tips are squarely on. I told you I wanted a 1/4 inch seam, and I can easily see that now. Can you see here? That way, when I do my sewing, I won't cut that tip off. So I'm going to cut confidently now, she says. Another way to cut it, if you haven't got a cutting board like this, a rotating one, is find the centre point of your diamonds and then go 1/2 inch either side and cut that edge. And now I can lay out each column. The first one, I'm going to begin with beads at the top, and then batik, then beads again, and I'm going to fold over and then sew on that 1/4 inch line, just making sure that I leave the tips of the points showing. Use a pin to match up your points. Then as your sewing line will come slightly to the right of the crossover here. And your points will end up matching like that. So here's one column. It's 72 inches in length, and I think that this is too long. Rather than this being a rectangle, I'm going to make this quilt as a square. It'll measure 63-inch square. Yes, I think a strand of 7 will be sufficient, so I'm going to take off that last block. Now I've misted and ironed, and I've taken the seams on the odd columns downwards and the seams on the even columns upwards, so that they're now nice and crisp. And as we look down the quilt at the pattern, I want you to see that I've used the darkest fabric in the patches at the outside, so that when we get to the middle, the quilt lightens and then goes dark again. Let me show you from a distance. All I've got to do now is to sew each column downwards. When connecting those columns, nest the seams, but also make sure that your points meet. And I've done that with a pin. So here is my finished topper. Now, it's so big already that I've decided not to add an additional border. I'll just do a dark trim. I will be making a quilt sandwich and then showing you how I quilt this on a domestic sewing machine. So for now, this is Maggie, the Cheshire Crafter. Come back and join me for that, won't you, in part 3. Bye.